Wait for everybody to get in here. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for sharing your lunch hour with us at the Humanities Cafe. My name is Stacy Chidaushe. I'm the program coordinator for the South Dakota Humanities Council, and I am delighted you're here. We're going to jump right into it because there's so much to talk about today. I think we've all heard the old adages that say truth is stranger than fiction, or if something seems too good to be true, it probably is. We've all heard those, right? At least maybe once or twice. But what if the sentiments behind those adages are actually true? Like, how do we learn to recognize situations and issues for what they truly are? One surprising means actually is through the reading of dystopian literature. Dystopian fiction has been an effective tool for looking at society's fears and challenging political cultural systems for a long time. So maybe it comes as no surprise that the popularity of dystopian narratives is larger and more important than ever. So here to talk to us today about the importance and impact of dystopian literature and its reflection in contemporary society are two scholars well-versed in the subject, Dr. Paul Baggett and Dr. Skip Willman. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us. I'm going to start off here by asking you to tell us a little bit about yourselves, who you are, what you do.
Paul, do you want to go first?
Sure. Yeah, I'm Paul Baggett, and I'm in SDSU. I'm also the graduate coordinator of our program. I kind of approach this whole genre with my specialization in literary naturalism, late 19th century, early 20th century naturalism, which was really kind of closely aligned to kind of science and literature, and the ways in which science replaces kind of divine forces for influencing human behavior and all that. And so, of course, Darwin and Darwinian in the natural sciences, as well as Herbert Spencer in the social sciences, are trying to explain the human condition as well as the non-human world. And so from that, I was introduced to a lot of these earlier dystopian works that many of you may not even be aware of. But and a lot of my research has been in Jack London, who wrote a very early dystopian work called The Iron Heel. We can talk about that later on. But anyway, I'm up to 28 years here in South Dakota, and that's kind of what I'm about right now.
And I'm Skip Willman. The name says Clyde. That's my real name. Skip is my nickname. I've been at the University of South Dakota in the Department of English since 2002. So that's probably 24 years, something like that. I think I first got interested in this topic back when I taught a science fiction course at Indiana University, where I got my PhD and realized that a lot of these science fiction classics were more or less dystopian novels like Brave New World, etc. And I'm interested in contemporary. I teach critical theory and contemporary literature. And so, again, one of the kind of the more contemporary novels that really got me into thinking about dystopia was William Gibson's Neuromancer, the cyberpunk classic from 1984, and then Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale from 1985. I've been teaching a honors version of a utopian dystopian literature course for years, as well as a senior capstone, and they are I don't want to say great fun because some of the stuff is really uncomfortable and awful. 1984 is not great fun, but it's really wonderful literature and gets us thinking. So that's been my kind of entree into dystopian literature.
Wonderful, thank you. So, and you mentioned utopia, dystopia. So let's jump right in with that right off the top. What's the definition of dystopia versus utopia?
Well, from my understanding, utopia is kind of a play on words between something that means no place and good place. So when Thomas More kind of coined the phrase back in 1516 with utopia, I think it was kind of a notion of a little bit of critical distance so that he wasn't necessarily associated with this and could be satirical about it in ways. But that means, yeah, no place or good place. And then dystopia, from what my reading, I guess John Stuart Mill was the first person to actually coin that in 1868 in a speech that he gave. And basically, it just means a bad place, from my understanding. Paul can correct me if I'm misstating the facts here.
No, I think that's a pretty accurate historical explanation, but I do think as we're talking about this genre, I think we're going to be, uh, I think we always kind of see them as two sides of the same coin because oftentimes these kind of utopian ideals result sometimes in kind of dystopian, um, systems. And conversely, the same thing. Sometimes there's a utopia at the end of a period of dystopian, um, conditions of control and technological overreach and so forth. So I think that they're almost inseparable.
I think Margaret Atwood, who wrote The Handmaid's Tale, said that utopias we can only imagine, but dystopias we've already had. And so that's how I try to keep it straight in my head. So, like you mentioned a couple of them, Skip, already, but Paul, you have a more of a historical aspect to your work. So, what are some examples of classic dystopian novels we've probably all heard of at some point? So we kind of have the idea we're all on the same page.
Yeah, ones that we've heard of, I think, you've already mentioned Atwood a number of times, and to think about that represents a certain period too. I mean, that was written in the 80s, but I think Fahrenheit 451 you've mentioned, we've comes up a lot. Brave New World, Lord of the Flies. Um, as I mentioned, the Iron Heels, an early dystopian or oligarchic film that text that London writes just at the turn of the 20th century. He's anticipating what's happening in the 30s, even though he's writing this just in like 1906, I think, or 1908. Herland, many of you may have heard of that. It's a kind of a dystopian feminist novel. I think that's, it's remarkable. I don't know if, again, I don't know who my audience is all the time, but my late 19th, early 20th century Herland and Looking Backward by Edward Bellamy. Also one of the early utopian American works that is a kind of a socialist work. And of course, we can't ignore the force today of young adult fiction with the Hunger Games. I had a student write about the Hunger Games for a master's thesis here at SDSU. So, Skip, I've left out a lot, but
I would just throw into the mix a couple of other texts. Some of H.G. Wells's work is considered dystopian. So something like The Time Machine, where he goes forward in time and kind of discovers this nasty world of Eloy and Morlocks and exploitation or all of that. And then the novel that is sometimes credited as inspiring Huxley and Orwell, which is Yevgeny Zamyatin's We, which was written, I think, published 1919, 1920, kind of detailing kind of a response to the Russian Revolution and fears about collectivization or the collective, and anticipating a lot of the themes that Orwell will really lean into in 1984. I would also just mention that, we are in a golden age of television. And so right now on TV, I'm watching Silo, I'm watching Fallout, I'm and I hate video game adaptations as a rule, but I'm loving Fallout. And I think it's a really interesting show as well as Silo. And that's just the beginning of kind of what television is doing. And then we have all of the kind of copies of the Hunger Games, like Divergent, The Maze Runner, some of those texts that are really attempting to capitalize on the success of the Hunger Games.
Severance is a show that's really popular in the office here, but I haven't watched it yet, so don't give any spoilers or anything. I might get to it. But we've come so far, and it seemed like a little bit. It seems like a little time period, but the history of dystopian literature goes back to about the 19th century, right?
From what I understand, yeah.
Some people throw in Gulliver's Travels of Swift in the 18th
Oh,
century,
yeah,
which is kind of a travel narrative of sorts that is, again, calling into question kind of present conditions in society and imagining other worlds as well. So we could go even a little bit earlier, but it's really kind of the ramping up of well, if you begin with Thomas More and kind of humanism, and then the industrialization and capitalism really intensifying over the 19th century. Um, if I could just add that I think it's interesting, there's a lot of bad fiction out there, a lot of bad dystopian fiction, and maybe we're going to get to this later, but I think all this stuff becomes more interesting if you historicize, if you really understand that historical context, and understanding, say, what's going on in the 1930s when Sinclair Lewis writes, "It can't happen here," which is, again, and 1984 as well, looking at the very particular historical conditions and them speculating about the future. Same
right.
thing
Because
could happen.
1984 was Cold War, right? He wrote that as like a response to the Cold War. And then like Fahrenheit 451, Bradbury was like that was about the time of the Red Scare of the 1940s, I think. And to tell me if I'm wrong, but Brave New World 2 with Huxley, that was, mass production, Fordism, Clockwork Orange, like the, 1960s teenage angst, or, young people trying to tell society, don't tell us what to do. So I've noticed that too, Paul, in all the historical piece. I think it's fascinating because, again, going back to what Margaret Atwood said is, everything is not everything is based on something that's already happened, and that
Yeah,
she writes,
Yeah.
and
I would just
basically it's
throw
built on societal fear.
I would just throw in a quick addendum to 1984, which is that, I mean, it's really about totalitarianism, whether it's fascism or communism. And I think, it's published in 48 about, and, Orwell obviously had experience with communism in the Spanish Civil War that he wrote about in Homage to Catalonia, a very, horrific kind of the subversion of the whole socialist ideal. Um, was very important to him. So he was, well aware even before World War II broke out about kind of what Stalinism was all about and seeing it as a totalitarian danger. But I don't think you can forget about fascism as well and the kind of the pursuit of power for its own sake. Uh,
yeah.
Hitler's there, Stalin's there. It almost predates the Cold War, but it is, there's a kind of anti-communism in there.
Interesting. So are there different types or genres of dystopian literature?
Well, I mean, I think that there are the ones that rely kind of on the science fiction aspect of things. So if you look at Brave New World by Aldous Huxley, there's a lot of what, extrapolation, taking kind of contemporary trends, things you're worried about, throwing them kind of speculating about how things are going to be 50 years down the road, 100 years down the road, whatever, and creating a kind of cautionary tale. So there's the very science-based ones, or I would even claim that William Gibson's Neuromancer, kind of talking about the emergence of computer technology and the kind of interface between uh, technology and the human body, all of that kind of stuff is very science-based. Whereas, if you talk about Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale, there's not really any new technology. It's not about that. It's about taking kind of contemporary fears, contemporary anxieties, contemporary trends, the rise of the moral majority, the kind of the Reagan revolution whereby evangelicals and kind of conservative power comes together in interesting ways, and for her, dangerous ways. That's more speculative. That's not reliant on science, I think.
And it's worth mentioning that Atwood writes this comes up with this when she's living behind the Iron Curtain and living in Berlin and Poland and seeing uh, then Soviet control and East German control and imagining this kind of theocratic control. And she is responding, I think, to the Reagan moral majority of the 1980s, but she's also tracing it deeper into our own Puritan roots. So there's a lot, I don't want to say it's ahistorical. I think it's very much devoted to particular historical moments that we see this is something I was teaching my grad students just this week about the discourses that you find circulating within a community of the 1980s. You can see the language reinventing itself or coming into, let's say, our contemporary vernacular. Make America Great Again was something that Ronald Reagan campaigned on. And if you go back to the 1930s and 40s, you have America First with Father Coughlin, who was a priest on the radio, and as well as Huey Long. And I'm mentioning those two figures because they are present in some of the earlier political fiction of Sinclair Lewis, as well as Jack London, also concerned about what's emerging out of the early 20th century.
I would just
really, oh, go ahead, Skip.
Can I jump in and then
absolutely
thing that you said, Stacy? One of the things you mentioned about The Handmaid's Tale was that all of these things had kind of happened. In her essay collection, In Other Worlds, which I highly recommend, it's a collection of essays and book reviews that she talks about 1984. She talks about Brave New World. She also mentions that one of the kind of the inspirations, and in that vein of like, I'm going to take things that have already happened in world history, and I'm not going to invent anything that hasn't happened, was the Iranian Revolution of 1979 and the establishment of the theocratic state there, and the having to wear the hijabs or the head coverings. All of that stuff was also part of it, and it kind of just translated into an American context, and kind of, as Paul points out, that kind of Puritan tradition. It's kind of a weird hybrid form of them.
So there's a question in the chat, and before I jump into that, it's about dystopian fantasy. So I wanted to, if you guys could kind of gear us or steer us into the relationship or how they differ from other genres. Well, like, how does dystopian literature relate to science fiction, and how does it relate to fantasy? Because they're not the same, but they're connected, right?
I mean, I would probably start by saying, first off, that there are plenty of critics out there like Darko Suvin, Frederick Jameson, who claim that utopian and dystopian fiction are kind of a subgenre of science fiction, primarily because they rely on certain kinds of things, like, for instance, in dystopian literature, extrapolation. Science fiction, as we've already kind of talked about, what is the world going to look like 50 years from now, given the situation that we have now? What are the danger points? How is that going to be exacerbated in the future? The other thing is a concept established by Darko Suvin called cognitive estrangement, whereby we enter this kind of strange new world and have to kind of figure out the rules of this world and understand its differences. And then that difference gets us to kind of rethink our own situation. And I think that the best example for that is something like Ursula K. Le Guin's The Left Hand of Darkness, whereby we have a kind of Federation of Worlds that goes to a new planet called Gethin, or Winter, to see if they want to join the Ecumen, which is this federation of planets. And so they send an emissary, and this emissary confronts a very different situation on Gethin, whereby all the inhabitants are neither male nor female, but could become male or female, carry a kid, not carry a baby, etc., based upon kind of their circumstances at the time, who they're around. But it's random. And all of our kind of gender expectations get played out or revealed. or our kind of biases and prejudices and kind of the way, even when we use language, when you're addressing someone who could be a male or female, do you say he or she? I mean, we're having pronoun discussions now, but you can imagine on a planet like that, things can get a little strange for our guy whose name is Genly A or Genly I to navigate because he's just not used to it. And but it gets us to think about our own gender constructions and how we operate.
It is it an accurate statement to say that dystopian literature um, differs from science fiction and that dystopian literature focuses solely on the negative? Or is that a leap too far? Where science fiction could be about adventure and all kinds of things, but dystopian literature always seems, is that accurate to say that it's a focus on negative, like the negative aspects of science and technology?
I mean, I think, of course, we could find some science fiction pieces that maybe aren't so negative as you say. And I
Mhm.
guess these kind of exercises for me, I thought about this just about a summer ago when I was putting together a grad seminar called Visions of Tyranny in American Culture. And I had to assemble all these texts and I was all over the place thinking, okay, and I find that they're not all um, dystopian per se, but I think it's less interesting for me to worry about classification than more about conceptual and interpretation about what are the different fears that modern society is facing and what different social fears are, what are the dangers, and dystopian fiction tries to address those kind of fears in different ways. um, uh, so and that's we could think about some subgenres like alternative history. I taught Philip Roth's The Plot Against America, which is it's a great HBO series if you get a chance to see it. But nonetheless, he is imagining a world in which Charles Lindbergh wins the presidency, and he is an American firster, and beats Franklin D. Roosevelt um, during the 30s and the kind of the rise of anti-Semitism and what would happen. And then, and Roth is writing this. He insists that this is not supposed to be an allegory for the present conditions that he's living in. And I think he writes this maybe when we were going into the Iraq War during the George W. Bush period, if I'm remembering correctly. But it speaks to those fears that I think are recurrent within history. So I guess I want to go back to this kind of desire to classify. I think, or not. I think rather than worrying about that, every writer hates some. I know I'm teaching like Octavia Butler right now, and her parable of the sower, and she really suffered a while by being kind of limited to science fiction genre. And of course, she is a science fiction writer. She won the science fiction prize, right, the Hugo, but she's doing so much more. She's addressing environmental catastrophe. She's dealing with race and gender issues, and yeah. So I think the question I have oftentimes is, you know, how effectively do they wrestle with those ideas? The only genre I think I do kind of remove from this is kind of fantasy fiction, which almost, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Skip, but I'm just wondering. I can't say I've read a lot of it, but I think it's supposed to be more kind of dealing with larger mythic forces and archetypal figures of good and evil. It is, yeah, you have these supernatural elements, and so forth. So, drawing the line between science fiction and fantasy might be worth wrestling with a bit, but don't know what you all think.
There's a question in the chat from Anya. Is it possible to have science fiction without dystopian elements?
I mean, I think so. I think, if we think about some of the Well, I mean, it's hard to say because it depends on how you interpret dystopian. I mean, I was thinking, one of the shows that I'm watching and books that I read as a kid and have reread recently was Isaac Asimov's Foundation series. And it's, I mean, there are dystopian elements to it, but I wouldn't necessarily say, hey, this is all about dystopia. Although, Harry Seldon is this guy, intellectual mathematician who's created this um, science called psychohistory that is an attempt to kind of map out or where is society going and predicting the future and realizing that the galactic empire of 10,000 so many worlds is going to collapse, and how do we get civilization back on track in the best way possible as quickly as possible, and that is to kind of create a storehouse of knowledge and then an organization to promulgate that after the fall of the galactic empire. So is that dystopian? Is that utopian? Yeah. It's all wrapped up. And I would go back to what Paul said earlier, is that the utopian and dystopian are so interlinked. So, for instance, think about the Handmaid's Tale. Um, she says there that someone's dystopia is someone else's utopia. You think of and I think you mentioned that, Stacy, in one of your comments, or is that, for the commander, man, life is peachy. It's patriarchal. He's at the top of the heap. It's just freaking great. And it's this, theocratic justifications for it and a power structure that works really well for him. And of course, he sells it as that. So Aunt Lydia, for instance, one of the conversations that we get into when I teach this novel is that Aunt Lydia is an interesting character. In the TV series, she's really a monster, and she is kind of in the book. But she says, in the past we had freedom too. Now under Gilead we have freedom from. Don't knock it. You know what I mean? Like being safe to walk for women to walk down the street because they have these draconian rules about all of this stuff. There's some freedom there that she's obviously rationalizing or legitimating this kind of theocratic state, but there is a sense in which there's an argument to be made, as dubious as it might be, but that those things are wrapped up. And I would also add that if you are depicting a world based upon contemporary fears and anticipating where it's going, you don't want it to go there if you're the author, right? I mean, it's a cautionary tale for a reason. There is a utopian impulse behind the depiction of dystopia in writing it, in that this is, if I say that that's bad, then it kind of implies that there's something good or that we should be pursuing otherwise.
I wanted to say, Christina, I haven't forgotten your question. We're going to circle back to that because that's actually something I want to bring up in a little while with something connected to that. So before we get too far into things, what are, just for the sake of groundwork, what are some common themes or features that are common to almost every dystopian novel, or even a film, for that matter?
Go ahead, Paul. I'll let you start.
Well, I think there's a certain kind of threat of in dystopian and utopian again. There's an idea in utopia to create an ideal society, usually misguided, but nonetheless. And there's ideally some idea of freedom and liberation at the expense of others. Even as Skip was talking about the Handmaid's Tale and the commander, I even think that there's moments in there where he's incredibly alienated. He is in his office. He skips off to his gentleman's club. And so these worlds are not good for anybody. Of course, there are people that suffer much more from it. But what I love about dystopian fiction is it's kind of thinking about it ecologically. These ecosystems that are created are unsustainable. And result in collapse. Now, maybe the problem is you don't know if it's going to take, 3 years or 3 centuries. Jack London's The Iron Heel. It's an interesting novel because it's a manuscript discovered in 700 years later, 27. It's actually, they redo the calendar So the calendar is BO BOM, Brotherhood of Man, which is 400 years old. So it's a socialist utopia after a period of 300 years in which oligarchy reigns. And these, wealthy people consolidate power. It very much resonates with what's going on today. Um, and and so this kind of manuscript survives and is dug up, and they're trying to make sense of who's what and what happened. Um, anyway, I guess I'm curious in terms of good and evil and all that. It's often easily identifiable, but what's wonderful about these is um, oftentimes even those people who are between good and evil are somehow complicit unless they just call out outright revolution.
Yeah, I mean, I think Paul's title of his course, Visions of Tyranny, is one of those nice ones that might serve as kind of a universal themes of dystopia. Although I'm hesitant to say that, tyranny is in every dystopia. Um, but I think that is part of the question. And of course, we have to weigh the kind of the individual versus the collective. And I think going back to even Brave New World, this notion of social stability and what are we willing to give up for social stability? Is social stability, an end in itself, and we will do whatever it takes. If it's the giver, we're going to rob ourselves of our historical kind of memory and certain experiences and colors and sounds, or if I'm remembering correctly, it's been a while since I've read The Giver. What are we willing to give up for that? But a lot of the repressive governments that we see from the Hunger Games, to the Brave New World, they're all about maintaining social stability, order, and how important is order to, as opposed to freedom.
So kind of steering away from there's a loss of individualism in favor of a collective ideology.
Well, I think that's part of it. I mean, like I lean a little left, so I'm kind of a fan of collectivity in that we don't necessarily we can reach our individual potential only through kind of having collective support,
Mm-hmm.
you know. So that's my kind of point is that it's a synthesis of individualism and collectivity that needs to be maintained. Whereas in something like, Brave New World, there's the Savage, John Savage, whatever you want to call him, is all about individualism and rah 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 and all of this stuff. And um, while the novel is kind of ambivalent, is it a utopia? Is it a dystopia? Savage goes into the novel thinking, "Oh, utopia! This is great, flying cars and beautiful things," and then he realizes it's actually a dystopia. And it has sacrificed individuality, and it has sacrificed beauty, history, art for the sake of stability. So we all get drugged up on Soma, and we're just happy campers buying, 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 and going and playing, you know, golf on some 3D, you know, kind of country estate somewhere.
So when I was kind of digging into this, I was joking around before we went live with everybody that this has been swimming around in my head since September. I actually contacted Skip Willman and Dr. Willman in October to have this discussion because these things just fascinate me. And at that time, I discovered, there's the Orwellian type of dystopian literature, which is totalitarian or fear-based. And then Aldous Huxleyan, where it's the technology and stuff like that, and Kafka, Philip Dickian. So there's different kinds, I guess, of dystopian literature that would take probably a long time to break down it. But those kinds of descriptions are based on things that were published quite a while ago. So like between the 20s and the 60s. So why haven't there been any new genres developed like cli-fi? Because there's a lot of climate fiction right now. Is there a potential for new genres or categories? What would they be?
I think that it's a matter of emphasis. So technologies, certain new technologies are much different, but the technological kind of threats that we see in the 1920s and 30s even, and of course in Brave New World, which is the 40s, right? Is much different than AI and than the larger kind of apparatus we're seeing and the threats that people fear and lots of sci-fi writers are writing about. I know, Stacy, you provided these questions to us earlier, and I was trying to break it down historically in terms of those themes. And so, and this is what I came up with. I was looking at early 20th century. You have mass society, technology, bureaucracy, and we see that in We and Brave New World. And in the mid-century, you have totalitarianism, propaganda, media control in 1984, Fahrenheit 451, Clockwork Orange, which we haven't talked about. And then late 20th century, even to the present, we have environmental issues, as you say, cli-fi, late capitalism, technology, intensification of technology and its means of control. And also you have interesting issues of race and gender. Handmaid's Tale comes out in 85, and The Parable of the Sower is 1993, an African-American writer, Octavia Butler, writing about this. And of course, television and film, is kind of opening these and offering more visualizations of some perhaps things that were merely more abstract, or even more. There's even more spectacle involved in the visual medium. But we could talk about whether they're. I'm wondering about what happens to the dystopian narrative once it's adapted to the screen. If it loses or it weakens its force and power, depends on who's dealing with it, right? Who's handling those issues. So,
Tara has a question. Go ahead, Tara.
Yeah, I was curious. You talk about a lot of those classics and stuff like that. Are you studying any of the latest? The one I'm referring to and thinking about in this discussion is New York 2140. So set, way into the future. And you were talking about that climate one, and that deals a lot with that, with the whole climate change and New York being underwater. Then, if you've not read that one, but curious if that with what you were talking about, Stacy mentioned the fear-based, or are these books meant to either create fear or have us ask what if? Because for a lot of us, the classics, have happened, or we've seen 1984 from when it was written to actually seeing that year or whatever, if that's what it's meaning, something in the future. But this one I thought was really a curious one to see how things go. We won't be alive, in 2140, but the trajectory of that. And are you studying any books like that currently, and comparing them with some of those classics? So,
Paul, do you want to take that one?
Well, I was going to ask you if you want to take it. I haven't read that novel, and nor have I read a lot of the contemporary stuff because I'm engaged in earlier histories. But I guess I all this is great. My question all the time is, do these more recent novels become merely a vehicle for I don't know, basically a political point, or do we really, do they really grab us, and why do they grab us? And I find that's a really compelling question, and I think I'm really more drawn to these earlier pieces because I like to historicize these earlier pieces. We're so close to so many threats right now that I'm less interested in more of the kind of the the novels people are writing today, because they're really trying to engage something without the advantage of hindsight. I don't mean to dismiss it, but I do think, again, even earlier dystopian fiction, some of it's not very good. They become almost like political tracts, or when the plot and the character development is minimal. Instead, it's interrupted with this long kind of pages of commentary or history of who these people are, and trying to kind of make meaning of it. But I'm just wondering, yeah, why people, what is popular today, and how effective is it to, when it comes to engaging some of the issues of the threats of media, right? And spectacle culture, when so many of this fiction is about spectacle.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Tara, I haven't read New York 2040 either, 2140 either. So I will kind of talk about the Hunger Games instead, which is kind of where I end my course on utopian dystopian fiction. And I think, like, Paul likes to historicize, and I like to take the pulse of the culture as a contemporary person, because I won't get that historical kind of hindsight, at the moment. But I mean, I think what the Hunger Games does really interestingly is I mean, the argument that I've always made about the Hunger Games is that it's kind of like a Rorschach test, that you can project on the Hunger Games whatever you want, i.e., insofar as we have a division in society between the capital and the districts. We have in the capital an elite, however we want to define that. We can define it in right-wing terms as kind of a cultural elite, and then you have the working class, real people of the culture. And this is a revolution that is about taking down those elites. Whereas, if you look at it from a kind of left-wing position, it's about class, and it's about the rich and the powerful sitting in the capital. And you've got the working class people out in the districts who do the coal mining, the agricultural work, the building of the electronics, all of that stuff. And it's actually, I mean, the novel, if you wanted to be all kind of Marxist on it, is about class consciousness and then the necessity of revolution, because that's where it ends up. And so you start with this very dystopian novel that ends up kind of with this utopian impulse to make the world a better place. And we have a revolution. And, I'm sure that the people who stormed the Capitol on January 6th were thinking, let's go Mockingjay. That's kind of how they envisioned themselves as heroes of taking down, putting the right person in charge who's going to make America great again. And, it ends in kind of a both pox on both your houses, because immediately after they win the revolution, the districts decide to like reinstate the Hunger Games, except with people from the Capitol. And no, that's not going to fly. So Katniss does her thing, and she winds up back in District 12, is it? With PETA and their kids, and she's still suffering from PTSD, etc. And it's not a happy ending by any stretch of the imagination. But I think the Hunger Games, insofar as it's talking about the kind of the real inequality in this country, however we define that in terms of kind of cultural capital or wealth, that's something that's real. And that's something obviously that we're dealing with right now, with the big, beautiful bill, the tax cuts for billionaires, the cuts to healthcare, cuts to all sorts of things. She has found a way to touch both sides of kind of the political aisle with this story. And I mean, it's engaging. It's not particularly, I mean, I would agree with Paul that of the dystopian literature, it's not a great fiction or not a great literary work, but it's timely, I think.
Yeah. I think what is wonderful about the Hunger Games, and I think it really resonates with what I've been interested in throughout history, is the role of media and spectacle, entertainment, and how this kind of feeds. It is about class politics, but it's also about populism and media as a means of control, that control is kind of internalized through the media somehow. It's not the kind of, overt forms of authoritarianism. Yes, you do have that, but you also have this, um, the television and the movie screens and everything else that goes into this futuristic culture. And that speaks very much to today, doesn't it?
And Paul, you're absolutely right. I mean, like Suzanne Collins talks about the origins of how she came up with the idea for the Hunger Games. And she was just watching television one night, watching Survivor, and then there were all sorts of cuts to uh, the war on terror. And, it was that juxtaposition of the spectacle and Survivor with, a spectacleized version of the the war on terror and all of this stuff and just the violence along with the entertainment. I mean, they call it
Yeah.
for a reason, bread and circuses and all of that business. Um, it's born out of spectacle, and obviously the Hunger Games themselves are a spectacle, and it's kind of a commentary on our contemporary culture.
And that reminded me, going back, it doesn't have anything to do with media, but Battle Royale and Lord of the Flies, how they just, what you were saying, Skip, I was like, oh, I remember Battle Royale. Yeah, so there's that piece of like, that makes me think of Survivor, is that kind of thing, like people like literally, or I can't think of the one. It's big on Netflix. It's where they compete against each other and to the death, basically. But coming back on, sorry, steer the bus back on the road here. So why is dystopian literature, dystopian film so important right now? Because it seems like the most plausible dystopian novels or films are those that have at least one link between those societies and what's really currently going on. So people can relate to them. Is that an accurate assessment? And what's the value in that?
Yeah. I mean, let me go back to my spectacle talk. I really think and this is something I see Jennifer Woodman and the group here and some other people who've been associated with the English department here, and Dr. Michael Keller here, I think was here, but we used to teach a class in our composition about anti-intellectualism and media culture. And really closely aligned with that is kind of a certain populism. I can't tell you how important really information literacy and critical thinking. And I think what Marshall McLuhan's discuss about the media is the medium is the message, as well as Neil Postman, amusing ourselves to death. We used to teach these pieces, I think, in my composition classes. And I think a lot of these more recent dystopian fictions are dealing with forms of control that I don't think a lot of us really appreciated, that it wasn't this kind of these boogeymans of the history that are very real threats, the Hitlers and Mussolinis, but the ways in which media culture and illiteracy or illiteracy and the inability to really understand forms of control as they circulate within our popular culture. I think a lot of the best dystopian works are addressing those issues, and that's championing literary studies and representation, frankly, in the humanities. So,
well, they serve as a cautionary tale, right? Because it seems like it's not realistic or whatever, however you want to phrase it, but we see that it is possible. And I know Margaret Atwood wrote the follow-up novel. She doesn't call it a sequel. She calls it a companion novel, but it's called The Testaments. And she wrote that 34 years after she wrote The Handmaid's Tale, because she said in 2016, things were happening that felt uncomfortable to her with, the loss of females' autonomy and things like that. And so she brought that around in her follow-up book to address the fall of Gilead, to say, hey, these things, all of these dystopian societies could come to an end. And so the cautionary piece, though, is kind of takes precedence over what the best benefit, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would just say there have been plenty of cautionary tales about AI.
Oh,
2001 to Terminator to William Gibson's Neuromancer, plenty of AI. And, I mean, in the news today, Pete Hegseth, the defense secretary, wants to take off the guardrails of Anthropic's AI in order to make them kind of fully autonomous weapons that don't have any kind of human kind of regulation over targeting things. And also kind of there's about a component of surveillance as well. They want the guardrails off of surveillance. And I think that's scary as hell.
mm,
And you know, I don't know how many times we need to hear the horror stories of AI. Well, we'll see if Arthur C. Clarke is right. We'll see if James Cameron is right. We'll see if William Gibson is right about the dangers of AI. But unfortunately, I think it's going to be a lot sooner than we think. And it's not just about essays, being written by AI, much
yeah.
worse.
Well, in Bradbury, when he wrote Fahrenheit 451, I watched an interview with him, or read an interview that he had, where he wanted to instill in readers the reality that if they allow the government to take control of what they do or don't read, watch, or discuss, and allow for censorship in that way, you're asking for trouble. So, like, it's like the messages are there. It's like they've been telling us all along, but nobody's paying attention, or not. People aren't paying attention enough, I guess. There's a couple of questions that I do want to get to in here. Jerry asks in the chat, what Native American or Indigenous writers are writing dystopian literature? She's aware of Erdrich's Future Home of the Living God, but are you able to suggest other titles? Excellent question.
Yeah, sadly, I'm not aware of any that I could say. I'm sure they're out there. I'm sorry. Drawn blank.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned Erdrich, you stole mine. But I also, I guess, I know he's, for good reason, has come out of popularity as Sherman Alexie, and I know that there's problems with some of his fiction, but I did years ago teach his novel Flight, and I just did it again recently, which it's kind of a time travel novel going back to different moments in Native history, but it has a lot of problems too, that novel. But I am very interested in ways in which it falls under, I think, a larger umbrella that, or Atwood uses the term speculative fiction to speculate, the possibility of witnessing and even participating within different moments of genocide. And in that novel, basically, this young Native boy finds himself embodying kind of a white police officer of the past, and then Native people who being wiped out in different contexts. So, and of course, there's a lot of dystopian. I'm not remembering the titles of all the recent Native cinema. I saw Nolan in here. I don't know if that's the Nolan, one of my former students, but he introduced me to a lot of recent dystopian cinema titles that are just slipping my mind right now. A lot of zombie. It's a new zombie genre.
So I want to circle back to Christina's question now. I got to find it in the chat because that's something I wanted to really talk about. The surge in dystopian literature, especially young YA, the young adult literature. And when I was sitting there thinking about it, I thought, for young people, high school itself is a dystopia. So I think it's so much more relatable to them because they can step out of their current situation, which is very dystopian to a lot of high school kids, into a different alternative reality, maybe. But then, what Chris, why is there such an uptick? Like with Christina's question, she said, do you feel there is an uptick in dystopian fantasy right now because of the political climate the last 5 to 10 years? She feels that many of them have strong political themes, like her favorite, Aragon.
I mean, I would say absolutely. I mean, I think part of it is just the cultural logic of late capitalism, whereby Hunger Games is successful. So now every studio wants their dystopian series or franchise, and we're all going to market it. But I think that there's if you think of the Katniss Everdeen in the Hunger Games, teenagers, high school students, young adults, what the hell are we going to do with our lives? What am I supposed to do with my life? Is it going to be the same 10, 20, 30 years down the road? I think a lot of the questions that they have are going to be kind of projected onto these texts, or these texts reflect those questions. And then it offers them a kind of heroic narrative of what I can do, what will be my quest, or what Slavoj Žižek calls a symbolic mandate. I'm going to be the Mockingjay. I'm going to do something heroic. And, we all, I think at that age, envision us doing something great. And, out of this turmoil and out of this, this problem time, do that. And so I think the fears that many of these students legitimately have, based on our kind of social, economic situation, they find a perfect outlet in these dystopian texts.
Yeah.
I also think that just to piggyback on that, I think for young people, but also for this older folks, I think there's a lot of kind of theorizing and discussing. Rather than reading only dystopian fiction, do we really need to imagine, I think, what Atwood has called practical utopias or critical utopias? What would they look like? And I think you could Google it, but I think Atwood even has, I don't know if it's a virtual class or something like that called Practical Utopias, where she asks the students to kind of create their ideal society that is more about sharing and about fairness rather than about individual liberties and so forth, that we are also more self-interested rather than kind of collectively. And there's another term that comes up, practical utopias, or critical, or concrete utopias, I think is another one. There was a whole conference, I think, at Columbia University. You can look that up and listen to it if you really want a heady conversation with Etienne Balibar and some of these other, theorists of the Marxist tradition who are, talking about very real utopian exercises, not necessarily literary. They may be talking about collective communities. Bruno Latour, also an eco-critical theorist, who's talking a lot about environmental crises and what are they doing about it. So I also like to kind of, in my classes, to push students outside the book to look at what's happening in real world conditions. And I think it really means a lot to younger students, the younger generation.
Absolutely, and I think that's where the value of dystopian literature really lies right now. Is I think about what Margaret Atwood said when she said her books in particular do not include events that haven't happened somewhere in human history. So they serve as a warning about how fragile democracy really is. And so if you can read these dystopian novels and give it kind of a real world application, I think it makes it more real. And like I've started going down the rabbit hole of rereading all of these classic dystopian novels, because the new ones are kind of almost always somehow linked back to the classics. But because, like the saying goes, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. I think it's the same kind of thing. Is there anybody else have any other questions? Because we are going to be out of time here. I want to thank Dr. Willman, Dr. Baggett. Thank you for being here and teaching us all what your students are very fortunate to learn in your classrooms. I think there's still so much to talk about with dystopian fiction, dystopian film. Go out and find something to read, go out and find something to watch. I mean, go ahead and go to Netflix, watch TV. I mean, it's everywhere now. And kind of, take the lessons that are provided there. Is about, I mean, that's my little soapbox lecture there, but I wanted to thank everybody. If you'd let us know what you thought, there's a link in the chat if you want to provide feedback. And there, if you would like a printed list of if you want a printout of this chat, I can provide that to you. Just email me. My email address is in the chat as well. I'd be happy to send that to you through email. And I want to welcome everybody back in a couple weeks. We are going to go completely in the other direction. We're going to talk about the Crazy Horse Memorial. It's more than a mountain, and I'm super excited to have a lot of the Crazy Horse Foundation team here to talk. Hopefully, we'll even have one Zolkowski's grandson here to join us if he can come down off the mountain long enough to do that. So thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Let me know what you thought. Send some feedback. Anya says, here's a parting comment. Favorite dystopian novel is Lucifer's Hammer. Ooh. Lucifer's Hammer by Larry Niven and Jerry Ornell. So there'll be lots of options of things to watch and read in the chat. If you want a printout, let me know. But thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Skip. Have a wonderful day. Enjoy this spring-like weather. Hopefully it'll last. We'll see you again soon. Thank you.
Stacy.
Thank you, everybody.
Nice to see you.
You too.